hypocrisy is something that's levied against anyone that wants to talk about climate change. Oh, well, you go on to This Morning to talk about it. Where are your clothes from? Are you vegetarian yourself?
Gotcha.
Gotcha. Oh, the system is broken, but are you not living in the system?
Hello and welcome back to No Books on a Dead Planet, the podcast where we read climate books so you don't have to. Don't bother with that. That's silly. I'm kidding. I'm hoping by the end of this you will be inspired to read a climate book, even if it's not the one we're reading today. I'm welcoming you back for season 2, and Corry is our very first guest of season 2.
Oh, I didn't know I was the first guest. What?
Do you know why? Because I have actually recorded some other podcasts, but then I realised that it's going to be released at the end of October, which is spooky season. And you picked the spookiest book on my list that you could have picked. So I was like, well, obviously Corry has to be here for Halloween.
Good. Well, I hope you all come back after this one.
Ghoulish and deceased. We're now zombies in this apocalypse. Corry, thank you so much for agreeing to be on the podcast. I'm sure that you can summarise all of the things you do on the internet way better than me. So please do, for anyone who is audacious enough not to know who you are.
Goodness me, I do quite a few things though, don't I? So I've got my podcast, Sci Guys, where we talk about science stuff in a kind of funny and conversational way, and sometimes less funny and more serious. You were on an episode of that, weren't you?
I was. Guilty as charged.
That's one of my favourites, I think. Maybe you should go
No
and check
regrets.
that one out. But I also do YouTube videos and other such things. I'm on the internet doing things, you know, as people are.
An interdweller.
Yeah, I'm just
And
there.
I hear that the internet is actually, the temperature is fine. So as long as we just exist on the internet, I imagine that it's all going to be okay, right?
Yeah, that's what Mark Zuckerberg said, I think.
Right.
So that should... I mean, The Matrix is about that, right? That's what The Matrix is about. Living on the internet and things are fine.
It's going to be totally fine. So what I do with guests when they do agree to come on the podcast...
What do you do when they
which is
don't agree?
Well, we never hear from them again. So I'm glad that you chose the right way and you agreed to come on. But I usually give people a few suggestions of books that they might want to buddy read with me. And I have actually suggested this book to several people and they've never picked it.
They've all said no.
Yeah. And then I knew that you like science and I knew that you're up for like a big debate and you've probably read a lot about it already, so some of it wasn't a surprise to you. So I thought, maybe we'll test Corry. We'll just see. We'll put it in there as a wild card. And you picked it.
It genuinely, I looked at all of the ones that you sent and then some more as well. And this one just... It spoke to me in a way. I don't know. It just seemed like something I'd want to read, and it very much was. Spoilers.
It was calling to you. So the book that we have been reading is The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace-Wells, and it actually came out in 2019, which I thought was really I swear it's been around for longer than that, but I realised it was published on the basis of him writing a really long article that I haven't read in the New Yorker magazine in 2017. It went really viral, and it was basically like a nobody is taking this seriously enough long read. I found
that, I think, in the little author blurb on the inside.
Sexy little author picture. What a dashing man. Some people have brains and a jawline.
He's very pretty. I read through most of the book before I had a little look, and I was like,
Does it correlate?
Quite so pretty.
Maybe we just don't have enough symmetrical climate scientists.
Maybe the real reason the planet is too hot is people like that. No.
Force tweet or Force X, as we have to say now. What a world we live in. But yeah, I'd love to know kind of your impression of the book before reading it. But before I jump you into that, I'll tell you what mine was.
Yeah.
So I was working in publishing at the time when this book came out, and it was on every single book table ever. Like, whenever you walked into Waterstones, it was the book that was everywhere. I was seeing people reading it on the tube. I was seeing posters about it, and I thought that was really unusual because honestly, climate is not that sexy.
It really isn't.
And people don't want to hear about it.
No, people hate it.
Even more then than now. I actually think that in the last 4 years, people are more ready to hear about it, although it's still not a large percentage.
Yeah, I mean, I'd want to agree with you, but then Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, everyone hates them.
Yeah,
this
it's
weird,
not going well.
You know, what's it called? It's when you've got two things in your brain at once and they don't agree with each other.
My life. the condition of living. Oxymoron. No, I can get it.
People listening are genuinely screaming. It's not. I always forget it. It's not just a contradiction. It's a specific. Cognitive dissonance. There's this cognitive dissonance. Yeah. Sorry,
Yes,
continue with your impression,
the
please.
cognitive dissonance of the bestseller. That was like, why does everybody hate this? But also, obviously, people must be buying this book, and it was selling in droves. So I thought it'd be a really good idea to download it on my Kindle and read it in an airport. Oh no, not on a Kindle, in an airport. Oh no. So we got 20% of the way through. Then we had a little bit of a meltdown. And then I started a series on my channel called Positive Panic. And I can genuinely pinpoint beginning this book as the reason I started talking about climate on the internet.
That is insane. I can't believe this book is so powerful.
It's completely insane because I didn't finish it. And it's only on your push that I have actually returned to this book, because this is truly my spooky book. This is my Halloween read. And it's been that thing that every year I put it on my TBR that's like, this is the year I finished that book. This is the year. And it's never that year.
Oh my gosh. It makes sense, though. It does make sense. Where did you get to when you first read it?
I think I must have got a couple of chapters in. Once you get past the introduction, each other chapter is called an element of chaos.
Yeah.
So each chapter is dedicated to a different element of chaos, including hunger, drowning, disease, flooding, dying oceans.
Heat death. Woo.
So who knows? I don't think I made it to heat death.
Really? Yeah.
I think I made it to wildfires. I think I was around that mark, which is not as far as one would hope. But I was going to Iceland.
Oh, Lord.
On a work trip. It wasn't even optional. I had to go.
I'm going to be honest. You're so lucky that you managed to...
I
That
know,
you stopped
what a
when you did.
wanker.
No, I'm not even... When you stopped when you did, because there's a statistic slightly later on, I think, that would have really destroyed you.
Yeah.
The one about how much ice depletes from a single flight.
Yeah, it's really bad.
Yeah,
it's not good.
It's not good. It's not
Have you ever
good.
heard about ghost flights?
Oh, yes. Yes.
So that makes me feel
yes.
even more like sweaty. Ghost flights, for those of you who don't know, are all of the flights. I think there's like 10,000 a year that leave just from Britain alone. I'll correct that in the show notes if that's not correct. But it's around that number that are completely empty.
Yeah.
Nobody's going on. Nobody's having fun. Nobody's forming alliances with other nations. Nobody's having good experiences. They're just empty flights.
If you're mad at Taylor Swift, you should be more mad at... And I'm not saying don't be mad at Taylor Swift. Be mad at Taylor Swift and these ghost flights. But yeah, no, it's... The problem is bigger than we're led to believe.
I have a really slow, like very fast... Sorry, a very fast interjection with that. I was thinking about Taylor Swift recently, as one must if you go on your homepage as a woman.
Queen.
She flies everywhere, right?
Yeah.
But her fans are so dedicated that if she didn't fly to them, they would definitely fly to her.
Yeah.
So is it actually more efficient that we're moving our pop stars around a lot? Do I sound like a boomer when
No,
I say
I
pop
understand.
stars?
I understand
Our
you.
pop stars.
That's a word. She's a pop... But no, I actually... Controversial opinion. I do love Taylor Swift's music.
Great.
I don't think you could see her album behind you there.
Lover is looking at me.
Oh, it is.
In record form, no less.
I found out I'm not a Swiftie. I don't engage in
wow.
fandom, so I found out that apparently that's one of the least enjoyed albums.
Oh my god, I love that album. That's
It's a good
one of
album.
the ones I like.
It's a
I
good one.
only like that one and 1989.
Really? Wow.
Father forgive.
We should talk about this at
Yeah,
another
this
time.
should be-
But no,
We'll do a spin-off episode called Swifties for Climate.
I think it's interesting, right? It's an interesting thought. Is it more impactful for all of her fans to be traveling or for her? And yeah, that does make sense. But also, she uses her plane for things that she doesn't need to use her plane for. I
fun.
think that's the issue. And she lends out her plane to other
Yeah.
people, and it is a problem. Don't get me wrong. I think private planes certainly a problem, but there are also many more problems that are much bigger. And I feel perhaps sexism and this sort of online leftism really gets people into wanting to point fingers at people like Taylor Swift and say, haha, this person that you love, this celebrity, she's actually evil and the enemy too. And sure, in a way, yeah, but Taylor Swift also isn't, responsible for everything else that's going on that is much bigger in scale, as discussed in the book. Brought it
the
back.
segue back.
Oh, you know it.
Sweating, but we made it. That's why you're a professional podcaster. Yeah, no, I think that there's a lot of things going on there. I'd love to know a little bit about your relationship to science in that isn't mine, because my relationship to science tends to be, I'm not science. I can't science. That's scary. And I like it kind of it often intimidates me reading books like this just because I feel like intellectually I won't be able to grasp it. With this book, I just about did. But there were parts of it that I was like, I don't really know what's going on, but I'm sure it's going to be fine. But I think one of the like overarching things I took away from this book, and in a kind of good stoic way, was how small I am and how hard facts are to comprehend when they're huge, and especially like the scale of some of the facts that you find in the book. Is that something that you struggle with, or do you think because you read a lot of science anyway, some of it was like, I've already felt like a very small speck in this universe. I already feel, you know.
You know, I think it's interesting, right? Because this book for me was initially horrifying and then kind of cathartic a little bit towards the end, because I don't think there was anything new in it for me. Do you know what I mean? And there was definitely there was information, there were statistics that I had not heard before. My understanding of the climate situation we find ourselves in now has deepened quite a bit. But yeah, no, having the sort of background I've got, I kind of go into these things knowing that I don't know. You know what I mean? Knowing that, oh, well, I'm probably not going to understand everything, and that's fine. But I have this sort of drive to try to learn as much as I can. So I don't really feel intimidated going into something like this. I feel kind of excited because if I don't understand something, I'm just going to sit and work at it. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm really going to sit and try and figure it out. But no, this one, I feel like it wasn't terribly heavy on the science. It was more, here is what scientists are saying about how this is going to affect everyone. There were a lot of numbers and sort of just data, like very sort of, I guess, visceral things being thrown at you. So I guess from my perspective, probably because I'm so entrenched in like reading about science things all the time, it didn't feel super sciencey to me. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I'd kind of misunderstood the premise a little bit and I think because the blurb's a little bit misleading, but on page 35, which is quite far into the book, he does say like this is what the point of the book is.
Yeah.
Which again I was like, okay, now I understand it. The first bit was a bit confusing, but he said, we have all already left behind the narrow window of environmental conditions that allow human animals to evolve in the first place, but not just evolve. That window has enclosed everything we remember as history and value as progress and study as politics. What it will mean to live outside of that window, probably quite far outside it, that reckoning is the subject of this book. So it's more about what the science means for us in a practical way than it is explaining exactly how it works.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it was still really interesting. I want to bring up a silly point before we talk about some more serious things, because you said there was nothing surprising in this book. I want to know if you knew this, which is my favourite part of the whole book, which is about farting. Do you remember this part? Okay.
There were... Hold on, because I want to say, there were a number of parts that spoke about different kinds of fart. Are you talking... Go on.
Oh, I've missed the other farting bits. Anyway, this one was about how hydrogen sulfide is being released in loads of horrible places. The places aren't horrible.
Oh, yes.
The places have been made horrible
by
the hydrogen sulfide. And there's a particular part about the Gulf of Mexico and just off Namibia, which is ruining the coast, essentially. And then it gives you a fun fact, which is hydrogen sulfide is also one of the things scientists suspect finally capped the end Permian extinction once all the feedback loops had been triggered, which is why they think our noses are so exquisitely skilled at registering flatulence. So that smell of farting is potentially so genetically built into us that it smells like extinction, because that is literally what the last extinction smelled like. Is that what I'm getting? Is that what I'm reading here?
What I read that as was, this is a chemical that is, related to dangerous things, and so that's why it smells bad to us. And that's the same chemical that's in this. But yeah, I mean, generally, I guess. Yeah. I mean, so when I said I didn't find anything surprising, I want to be clear here. There were a number of things I didn't know in this, and a number of things I didn't know specifically. What I mean is that I've not come away from it with my overall view changed. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, there was nothing... There's nothing inherent about the farting that is going to change your whole life. It's changed my life, but maybe I think about it more than you do.
That's true. Oh, and I realised there aren't other farting bits. I was talking about burps. There's a lot of sort of body
leakage,
bodily things going on in this book, but not related to people all that often. surprisingly.
Not too much. I'd love to hear, I've got loads of things to pull out that I'd love to talk about, but I'd love to hear generally, because we were talking about you finishing the end of the book and you were like, I've got so many thoughts.
Yes.
And I'd love to know some of those just initially, because I feel like I've got questions to ask, but I'm not going to be able to guess what they are. I'd rather just skip to the juicy, what did you want to say?
No, good, because I've got a couple of things to
Okay.
say. So, I mean, ultimately the experience of reading this book was really interesting for me because at the time, we were going through, I wouldn't call it a heat wave. I don't think it was technically a heat wave, but in London, it was really hot. It was over 30 degrees, multiple days in a row, lasting all the way into the evening. Some of the time I had to go out, so I was on the tube reading this book whilst experiencing what the book was telling me was going to happen. And it's one of those experiences wherein, 10 years ago, I was 15. We were being told about climate change as a thing that was happening in the future. We were being taught about acid rain and how we'd basically kind of solved it. We've got all this renewable energy that we need to figure out. And 10 years later, we figure out a lot of it. But we're in a worse position than we were then, and it's not getting better. And if I go back to when I was almost 5 years old, sort of starting school, like 20 years ago, right? Climate change was a thing of sort of the present, but really kind of the future. And it's like, oh, it's going to be in a while, but we can sort it now. We figured out the CFCs. We fixed the ozone, all of that sort of stuff. And this book really, I think, sort of captures that experience of our relationship with climate change has changed sort of so much in the past 20, 30, 40 years, but in a way where it's almost difficult to even recognize it. And this is something that's been really thrown into stark contrast with me, wherein, London goes through heat waves, people die, and Americans make fun of British people for not having air conditioning. And I'm sat here thinking, you guys are laughing at climate change deaths. That's what's happening. People are dying because of climate change, and you're laughing at it. When we if we think back to 10 years ago, what would have happened? Like, what's going to happen when climate change starts affecting people? We don't need to think about that, what's going to happen anymore, because it is affecting people. And how we react to it is just by treating it as a normal thing, as oh, you were stupid to have done that, weren't you? Silly Brits can't deal with the heat. But then Texans dying from a bit of snow because their infrastructure isn't built to sort of, withstand it. It should be, because, we knew this was coming, and it ultimately comes down to the Texas government sort of being pretty bloody terrible. But still, it is climate change that is causing that sort of thing. So reading this book whilst experiencing sort of, the effects of climate change was so weird and interesting. And in a number of ways, despite the fact that this was written in 2019, it almost felt like it was written specifically for me right now. Even at the end, when it starts talking about Oppenheimer, and, I'm like, well, the Oppenheimer film just came out, and he's talking about pandemics, and how a pandemic could end up taking over the world. And I'm like, I know this was written before. I know it was written before, because the way that people spoke about pandemics in 2019 and luckily the first 2 months of 2020, was radically different than how we speak about them now, because before, they were hypotheticals. Yeah. The same as climate change was. This is something that could happen. And then we live through a world-changing event that has unforeseen impacts and such sort of deep and far-reaching sort of, effect on everyone on the planet. And suddenly we can't think of a pandemic as just being a story anymore. We can't go and watch Contagion with Matt Damon and be like, oh, this is something that could happen. No, we know what happens during a pandemic. We know what happens when it comes to climate change. And despite this being, 4 years old, it weirdly brings up so many things that are incredibly relevant right now. For everyone, but also specifically for me, just in the weird little references that are made. It felt really connected to the present moment, in an almost prescient way. It was really, really weird sort of getting through that. I really did enjoy it. I wasn't enjoying it to begin with, to be honest with you. Those first sort of chapters of just throwing every horrible statistic at you without any real sort of analysis, ultimately. It's just, this is it, and here's on to the next horrible thing, and here's on to the next horrible thing. I was like, Leena, what have you got me into?
What have you done to me?
You're single-handedly fueling depression.
I would love a randomized version of this book where you could just like press a button and it would give you a different chapter, because I feel like maybe out of order it would have been a calmer experience. And I do agree that the bad news is condensed into a part, and that is probably why I stopped reading.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. it makes sense.
And I think that's why it's interesting as well. Like, it actually made me feel good knowing that I would be speaking to you at the end of it, because I was like, somebody will have read this book at the same time as me and we'll be able to have the same freakouts at the same time. Because I don't know if you have this, but I often still struggle. And one of the reasons I made this podcast is I struggle to have conversations with people about it. And often I'll be reading a book and want to talk to the people around me I'm reading. Like, I want to talk to them about what I'm reading. But when it came to this book, I was like, I'm going to ruin anybody I talk to about this book. I'm going to ruin their day.
Yeah.
Like, do I want to be responsible ultimately for ruining somebody's day? My day's ruined.
Yeah, I had that conversation just this morning. So I was talking about it, and I was talking to Noah Finst, if you know who that is. Oh.
Never heard of him.
No, good. He's terrible. So I was chatting with Noah, and he was like, "Look, I feel strongly about this climate stuff, but also I don't know that much about it. It's kind of like it's a blind spot for him a little bit, in that he's aware it's just not one of the things that he's looking deeply into, which makes sense because there are so many problems that we're having to deal with right now that you do sometimes kind of have to pick and choose which things you throw yourself wholeheartedly into. But I said, look, I mean, this would help you understand the scale of it, because that was something he said he struggled with. He's like, I just can't personally understand the scale. I know it's big, but on that person, I just don't. It can't connect with me. I just don't get it. And he makes efforts to be sort of, climate conscious and whatnot, but more intellectually, I think, rather than that sort of emotionally.
Sunk in, yeah.
And I said, this book will probably change that for you. This book will make you understand, just in the way that, it's not just saying huge numbers of people. It starts putting those numbers into perspective, and not just in ways, that I would understand, in ways that other people might understand it. Not to say that I would, I don't put that. Not to say that I understand better than anyone else, but just there are different ways that people understand things, and it hits on a number of those different ways. It says, here's the economic sort of cost of this, here's the human cost of this, here's the sort of social cost. There's all these different sort of, measures for the effect of climate change here. But ultimately, what I said to Noah was, you can read this, you will understand it. I'm not giving you this book, and I'm not going to tell you what's in it, because I don't want to do that to you. You don't deserve that
you have to
right
do it
now.
To yourself.
Yeah, well, I'm just like, where you're at right now, like where he's at right now of, making the effort, and if I have the knowledge, that's fine. Do you know what I mean? If you want to set aside the other social problems that we're dealing with right now, like transphobia in the UK and sort of rising authoritarianism and all of that sort of stuff. If you want to put that on the back burner for a second and dive into climate, go ahead and do that. But honestly, it's a lot. It's a lot to sort of carry with you, and I want to recommend this book to people, but also, like, I don't. Do you know what I mean? It's almost like Roko's Basilisk, right? Wherein just the knowledge itself feels harmful. And ultimately, yes, people should read this book. I'm being very emotional and silly when I say I don't know if I want to recommend this book to people. People should read it, but like also, it feels bad to recommend it. It feels genuinely like, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it feels like it should be kind of a team sport, not something kind of like you shouldn't go rock climbing on your own.
Yeah, no,
you're
absolutely.
Like, whoa, don't just jump into that alone. And I think as well, like, it's interesting when we think about like how what we know informs all of our decisions and what we think about, because I feel like for me it's also like knowing this kind of stuff and reading the books that I have does inform the way I think, and that is a humbling experience to think that, like, I think I spent a lot of my 20s being like, what are my ambitions? Like, I want to hit my best self, and this knowing this kind of information makes you think, actually I don't really care about my best self as much as I used to, in a kind of quite a healthy stoic kind of way. You're just like, actually I might spend all of my time reaching my best self or doing my own goals or thinking about like stuff that's right in front of me that's very obvious, and I might not get to fulfill it if I don't also focus on this, which is again very dark. But I'm like, I could become the best novelist of all time, and like be good enough to win a Nobel Prize. But if I get to 90 and I'm an amazing novelist and there isn't a Nobel Prize to get, what's the point?
What's the point? I think you mentioned earlier that the sort of feeling of being very small kind of came up when you were reading this book, and I agree, but that's not a super new feeling for me. I'm not sure if you said it was like sort of new for you with this book.
I feel
don't know.
it is a little bit, or this definitely shrunk my idea of myself a
Right.
little, especially because it's one of the first climate books I've read that also talks about the context of the whole universe.
Yes, it does.
And how long history has been as well. That 95% of human history is called prehistory.
Yeah.
And we're only living in the 5%, like stuff like that I was like, what?
No, yeah, we've been
So,
around
yeah,
for, what
for
was
me.
it, 200,000 years, and the past, maybe 10, 50,000, up to that rough amount was, was recorded. And we only really think about recorded history, and we don't value anything else, our hunter-gatherer ancestors who, we think, oh, they were struggling to survive, blah, blah, blah. But what is it? I think it mentioned in the book that in some places in the world, because of malnutrition and whatnot, people are shorter and not living as healthily as our, hunter-gatherer ancestors might have.
Yeah.
Which, we really put sort of a lot of focus on the present. Whatever our conditions are now, we just see those as sort of standard, the status quo. This is how it should be. And when you think about the sort of difficulties that people faced, before modern times, before really what we call civilization, we see that as undesirable. But in a way, it almost isn't, right? Like, I know there's plenty of people that would probably rather be a hunter-gatherer and, sort of enjoy their lives sort of like hunting and gathering and being in a community and doing all of these things. And yes, there's difficulties, and yes, you're sort of working to survive, but, you don't have X, Twitter. You don't have social media. You don't have all of these problems that we have now that are born out of these big societies. In some ways, that is sort of, desirable. But in other ways, it isn't. It's all I'm saying here is that it's not as easy as saying what we have now is the best and what was back then is the worst. There are some things we could learn from that sort of previous model of, I guess, pre-society. But what I was going to say about feeling small is that I really like feeling small. Like, feeling small in the universe to me is beautiful. I really, really love the idea of sort of looking at the grand scale of the universe and realizing that nothing matters and finding joy in it anyway. It's very, I guess, everything everywhere all at once, really, if you want to, find a piece of media like that sort of encapsulates that idea. I think that does it brilliantly. This sort of like taking this sort of cosmic nihilism and turning it somehow into optimism. What is the meaning of life? There is no meaning. So it means you can find your own meaning, It's kind of touched on in the book there in an interesting way where it's like, well, what matters, why should we try and protect species? Does it matter that humanity dies out and the earth continues on, and then maybe some other species years, thousands of years, millions of years down the line starts to evolve and develop? We are a speck, smaller than a speck on a speck. What we do ultimately doesn't matter, and you kind of bring up questions of should it matter, and my answer to that is, well, human experience is all we've got. It doesn't matter. No. But does that mean we could just withdraw from society and just let what happens happen? Nah.
Yeah, totally.
Nah. Our experience is all we've got. It doesn't matter universally, but when has that ever been an issue? When has that ever actually meant anything? We can give meaning to whatever we want, We draw on cave walls, with paints and whatnot, and make weird shapes that don't actually look like anything, but we give those things meaning. And I think you can expand that out into the entirety of the human experience. Yeah, no, human life doesn't mean anything, but we probably should try and, save the planet a bit, because human experience is nice to have sometimes when things are good.
Yeah, I think you really run out of actions if you try to justify your actions by saying they have like some kind of cosmic meaning. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Then you end up doing nothing.
No, absolutely.
It's kind of, I think it's interesting as well because I've been thinking a lot about, I had a bit of we'll talk about this later, but I had a bit of a near-death experience last year.
Oh my gosh.
And in some ways it was really horrible, but in some ways I actually feel like maybe on a level I'm a happier person because I feel like I'm like, this is stolen time.
Wow.
I could do anything. Do you know what I mean? I'm having, like, is the point of my life isn't to achieve things, it's to enjoy achieving things if I want to, or just failing that, enjoyment. And sometimes I think about like why I don't have kids. I don't really want to have kids, but I do have close children.
I know what you mean.
We're gonna look for a different phrase.
I have been trying to find a different phrase for that exact phenomenon for so long, and there isn't one.
I am a stand-in anti, or actually, as he refers to me, Uncle Cat, which I think is a great
me?
understanding of gender, where he's like, you act like an uncle, so you are an uncle, and I'm like, I receive that. Anyway, anyway, the point is, there are some toddlers that I really care about in a parental, lovely way, and I think about their future, and I think like, I don't feel like I'm going to save the world on my own or at all, but if I am trying to do anything, I want them to experience as much fun in their life as I have had in mine, for the whole point of it being fun and funny and lovely. And it makes me sad to think that they won't be able to experience that. So if anything, it's just the fun continuum. I would like to, do you know what I mean? I'd like to pass that on for as long as possible.
Absolutely.
And it's a lot of it will be out of my hands. And that is okay.
Yeah.
I think partly the reason I think a lot of people would be scared to read this book in particular, but perhaps any book on the climate, is because you feel like it's less stressful to not know. And I feel like it comes to a point where it's actually more stressful not to know. And for me, reading a lot of these climate books has been cathartic, like you've said, just because it's kind of like a tell it to me straight, doc kind of moment of like, I just want to know what the diagnosis is. I'd rather know as much as possible so I can prepare myself and feel like I'm a participant in this rather than being in denial and not thinking about it.
Yeah, I get where you're coming from with that. You know, as I said, sort of this book, I don't think it didn't drastically change my outlook at all. All it's done, I think, is make me angrier. I the sort of level of knowledge I had on climate change was decent. You know, I've done some reading on it for my podcast and things.
You've got a great episode on Psy, guys.
Oh, thank you very much.
And one on veganism.
We do have one on veganism. Do you know what? We've probably got a new climate change episode coming out soon as well. Anyway, yeah, I know. So, but no, I mean, what I mean to say is that, you know, I've maybe been a bit more well-read than your average person on it, but certainly I wouldn't say, like, nowhere near sort of nowhere near anyone that really like sort of looks into it. But the level of information I had led me to, we are kind of screwed. We have this massive problem that's staring us in the face, and we have all of the solutions, but we don't want to use them. And it's felt that way for a while, and ultimately finding out more about this, it doesn't make me any more scared. It doesn't make me, feel any worse or better about the situation we're in, because nothing really seems to change. Ultimately, it seems that we're in a situation wherein, you know, we know what the problem is. Things are getting worse. We have solutions. We don't want to use those solutions. And ultimately, the only way that an individual can make a difference is if they come together with other individuals and force, you know, corporations and governments and whatnot to make the lasting changes that we need to make. So I don't know. I feel like I can't feel worse or better, because there is no worse or better for me. You know, I know that the human race is probably not going to die out, and even if it does, it's not a big deal. Who cares? Whatever. You know, worst case scenario in my mind is the world becomes unlivable, you know, the population is drastically decreased, and then we pick up the pieces and carry on like we always do. But I don't want that to happen. So, you know, I've hit my limit on bad, right? I've hit my limit on bad. I can't feel any worse about the situation than I already do. I can just feel angrier knowing that it's getting worse and worse and worse, and knowing, you know, more about even the sort of history of it, and all of these sorts of disasters, that sort of the background noise of my sort of adolescence and early 20s, those were all very much due to climate change, and we knew they were all due to climate change. But for me, it didn't feel that way, because, you know, well, hurricanes are a normal thing. How am I supposed to know that if you're in your 40s or 50s or 60s, hurricanes have dramatically increased in severity and in frequency? How am I supposed? I wouldn't know that, because, you know, when they were less frequent, I was 5 years old. I wasn't reading the news, so it's given me, you know, more, I think, rage, really, just by seeing, you know, how much we knew about this problem and how many solutions we had to it, and how not just how little has been done to solve it, but how much has actively been done to make it worse in that time. But yeah, no, I mean, you know, when it comes to recommending this book, I would definitely say, you know, if you're aware of sort of what's going on, I don't think it can make you feel worse. I don't think it can make you
I'd
feel
agree
worse.
with that. I don't think I felt more informed, but I didn't feel worse. And I think also like the argument for not reading a book like this because it's going to make you feel bad is a weird one, I think, because like you said, even though you don't want to recommend it to people, it's like you're going to encounter other people's anger about this. Like you're going to feel angry if you read it, but you're also going to, I think a lot of the kind of pushback against Just Stop Oil and a lot of people also not really understanding colonialism and stuff. Like one of the facts in the book was that 25% of all of the climate impact is going to be in India. They're going to have to absorb 25% of the whole world's climate impact. That's enraging. And you are going to encounter people in your life who are going to be very angry about that. And I think that not knowing that is going to give you a weird context for encountering other people's anger. So I think it's useful in that way as well. And I know that there were a few things in this book that were really hard to hear, that like he thinks that it's going to be impossible to keep like the world temperature below 2. That's bad. Probably 3.5. That's very bad news.
I mean, I was going to say, because the Paris Agreement, which, again, is just a little bit more than background noise for me, 2 has always been the number. And for about as long as that's been the number, I've been hearing, we're exceeding that. Like, every single news story is we're going to exceed that. Yeah, so, I mean, but there were some really sort of interesting statistics that hit me. For example, one that I feel like I should have known, but I didn't, was that by mass, I think 96% of the biomass on the planet is humans and their livestock.
Yeah. The livestock is like huge.
I'm aware that like we've got a ton of livestock. Obviously, I understand, the concept of having to have that amount of sort of biomass to feed, people. You need to have way more sheep than you have people to keep people alive, right? That's just how it works. Learned that in high school. But the actual, I think it's 96-4. 96% of by mass, I think, of the animals on the planet are for humans, and 4% are wild. And I don't even know if that 4% is including feral animals, which aren't even wild, like pigeons. Oh, do you know how there are pigeons everywhere on the planet? That's because we used pigeons for eating and for sending messages and as pets, and then we decided now we don't want them, and now they're pests everywhere. Rats came along in ships. We've got fancy rats because rats are great pets, and now they're pests everywhere. Like, everywhere on the planet. We have had such an insane impact. Rabbits in the UK? No, rabbits aren't endemic to the UK.
No
They're not
way.
supposed to be from here. They're an invasive species. Grey squirrels, also invasive. There are so many species everywhere on the planet that should not bloody be there, or would not. I say should not. That would not be there were it not for human activity. And yes, that's fine. I think we are animals. I don't think thinking of ourselves as better or greater than the other species on the planet is terribly useful. The weird morality we have about, we need to save the panda because, it's because of us it's dying out. We need to save this, we need to save that. We don't need to save every species. Some of them are going to go extinct anyway. I think it is pretty damning how many species have gone extinct, since the sort of Industrial Revolution. Absolutely. That's something I think we need to pay attention to and try to mitigate, not out of some sort of moral, obligation to leave no trace, but just out of, that is a sign of us destroying the planet that we live on. And, decimating these species, it sucks for us. Like, it sucks. Ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter whether future generations get to look at, dolphins or get to look at polar bears in zoos or whatever. Like, ultimately, that doesn't matter. That's not why I think it's important. I would like to see a world where all of these creatures can exist and we can have this sort of a diversity of life that we have, because I study biology and I find it really cool and interesting. I think it's great. But ultimately, it doesn't hold any real moral weight for me. It's more a case of we shouldn't be destroying the planet in the way that we are. Especially, like, at all, but especially when it's not really benefiting the planet, as in it's not benefiting the population. There's a very select few that it's benefiting. And that's it. Everyone else is worse off.
If we were all having fun,
if we were all
then
having fun,
maybe I could defend. Do you know what I mean? Like, look, let's go out with a bang. But it doesn't seem like anybody's having fun.
And for a vegan, that might be a crazy thing to say, that, I don't think it morally means anything if species go extinct. But, like,
I think it sounds like as well, like maybe I'm remembering your vegan episode wrong, but I feel like you talked a lot about the reduction of suffering. And I feel like with that, it's like species decline on a symbolic, moral, nostalgic level doesn't really matter. But on an individual dolphin to dolphin level, sounds like they're suffering. So again, it's that.
Yeah, I mean,
Did you say that?
Yeah, no, I guess that does. For me, it's difficult, right, when it comes to wild animals in that sense, because I wouldn't even say nature is cruel. I would just say nature is nature. You know?
Yeah, it's morally neutral.
Absolutely, you know. So yes, I think we should maybe lessen our impact and not cause undue suffering, but there is a limit to it. You know what I mean? There are animals that are going to die because of human activity, in the same way that there are animals that are going to die because of beavers building dams and whatnot. I don't think it should be on the scale that we've got it on now. And yeah, no, I do agree with you. Like, we want to limit that suffering. There is a level that I would say is acceptable. You know, if it's incidental and, you know, not causing great harm to, you know, environment, food webs, or, you know, species as a whole, fine. But yeah, no, I mean, the suffering that we're causing is incomprehensible. I mean, truly mean incomprehensible. Like, I'm looking at these numbers and I'm like, this is so big, my brain, nope.
Eject. It's
like,
gone.
Yeah, it's too big.
Yeah, it's a lot. And I think there's some comforting parts of it for me, included like kind of talking about how we think about capitalism causing the climate crisis, but also the climate crisis is a threat to capitalism. Like, if this continues, capitalism also has to end at some point. And he's like, there will be trade, but will there be capitalism? I don't know. And I was like, I would love to believe that, Dave. Dave, I'd love that to be true. I don't know if it would be.
Well, capitalists will tell you it wouldn't be, because capitalism, if anyone doesn't know this, capitalism is the natural... Yeah, capitalism is the natural order of things. I'm joking. Good Lord, that felt disgusting coming from me. Yeah, no, I did think that was an interesting sort of look there. I mean, ultimately, yes, it probably would destroy capitalism purely through destroying civilization. You know, it's going to destroy basically every economic system we've got, because they're not going to be able... You can't have any of the current economic systems that exist in a world wherein the population is tiny and disconnected and, you know, constantly dealing with... I don't even want to say natural disasters, because that's another thing that this book has sort of given to me, is the knowledge that natural disasters, as we sort of maybe conceived of them 10 years ago, 15 years ago, are so common now that this is something that came up quite a few times, is that in the future they may as well just be called weather. You know, they may even be considered weather, which I don't even need to sort of speculate about that, because again, reading it now, that is the case. It's 31 degrees in London in September, and it's hot, but it's weather. It's just weather. There was a heat wave last year, 40 degrees, you know? Maybe it wasn't technically a heat wave because there's a specific sort of number of days and temperature above that it needs to be for a heat wave. But regardless, it was 40 degrees in London, and it was too hot. It was too much. And yet it was mostly just seen as weather. In fact, people were kind of... There were whole sort of issues arising out of people talking about climate change during this, saying, oh, no, you should just go out and enjoy the sun. It's so strange to read a book say this could be happening by 2100 and be in 2023... and have that be my experience already. Yeah. It's so odd.
And it's odd to me as well that, like, it's kind of, like, in a weird way, nice to hear you get angry about it. Because I'm like, sanity. You know what I mean? I think we have a very disproportionate relationship with our own anger about it. And I think that's, like, really interesting. And I think also, like, I was just reminding me of a part in the book when you're talking about the heat, because I didn't realize, and the other things I didn't realize is that a lot of heat is related to our idea of productivity. So apparently 13 degrees Celsius is when we're most productive, and anything higher than that, our brains start to malfunction a little bit and really struggle to actually think clearly. So actually, the earlier I read this book, the more like this is the most likely I am to be able to understand this book, because this is the coolest my brain is gonna be.
Some of the science in me, right? The science boy in me read some of those things, and I guess I was kind of confused and interested as to what was meant by it. So yeah, an average temperature of 13 degrees is sort of, I think, the peak for productivity, which is what the US was at the time of writing, so probably around 2018, 2019.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious. I was curious as to whether some of those were related to other factors. Do you know what I mean? So as temperature increases, does that then have an impact on something else that then means that people can't be as productive? Ultimately, it doesn't make a huge difference, but it's whether it's direct temperature that causes those things, or whether all of the other sort of factors that come with that cause it. But it was really interesting to me seeing all this stuff where like, oh yeah, I mean, and it makes sense because personally during that sort of, I wouldn't even say heat wave, during that little hot moment in September, I spent 3 days basically unable to work. It was too hot in my house. I couldn't think. I was waking up dehydrated even if I drank like a ton before going to bed, and I just got very little done during the day because it was genuinely just too hot to work. And we don't have the infrastructure for it, ultimately. We really don't. There's air conditioning in public buildings, usually, sure, but homes don't have that luxury. And it's not as cheap to get an AC system here as it is in the US. And also, we're currently dealing with an energy crisis as well, which means
we can't be switching on any more lights or any more machinery. We're maxed out. Fairy lights are battery powered in my house.
Right? Yeah.
We can't be doing that. And another interesting thing about just thinking about the impact of it on our brains as well. And I think that's why sometimes I hear people say, oh, but we're in the UK, we'll be insulated from it. And I'm like, I cannot be operating, even if you are inherently selfish and inherently Tory and just thinking of yourself. I'm like, I would like you to protect your brain, and this is what is. And I think as well, it's the same with like, there was some really interesting stuff about the impact of air pollution, and it also talks about the links like to your memory, your attention, your vocabulary, and it's also been linked to ADHD, autism, Alzheimer's, all of those kind of things, which I'm like, I'd be really interested to read a paper on that. Woe betide I actually go to the notes and read his sources. Yeah. Maybe I will. Maybe this will be my time. But I did think that was really interesting, and this idea that actually in loads of ways we are living in this 5% of history. And I'm like, there's so many problems we're encountering that actually might all be linked to the climate. And again, we think about, oh, I don't have time to think about the climate because I'm working on this issue, or I've picked this issue, and I'm like, but what if? Conspiracy theory, they're all related.
Yes.
What if we're all fighting the same beast?
Right.
And we need to cut him off at the source.
No, absolutely.
It's a Jabberwocky.
Oh my gosh, don't you get back into that. No, just to touch on what you were saying about the sort of notes, I want to say I love the notes in this book. I genuinely love how they're sort of done, in that so many books you read of this sort of type, which I guess would be sort of pop science, really. I hesitate to call this pop science, but generally that's probably where it falls. It's made to be readable, it's made to be sort of accessible, but the specific quotes and then an explanation of exactly how he arrived at the phrasing that he did is brilliant. It's brilliant to have, because it's all too easy to say, oh well, here this study said this, therefore this other thing. And I really, really do appreciate it's just a full in some cases full explanations of, so this is what exactly I meant by this sentence. Yeah. Which I think is really useful for sort of clarity, ultimately.
And I really appreciate there's a part in the end where he talks about, he's like, you'll notice, as with my book and with anything Greta Thunberg says, is that we say probably and might be and most likely a lot. And he was saying like, well, I'm really paraphrasing here, but essentially what I got from it was, he's saying the science might be confusing and you might be looking for definitives that you're not being given. And the reason you're not being given them isn't because of scientific failure, it's because all of the predictors are human behavior and human decisions, and science can't predict for that. So when people are unclear about how bad it's going to get, this book is about how bad it could get, but we don't know, because ultimately it's like, I was like thinking about it called like the optional apocalypse.
Yeah.
Whereas
that's a good one.
It is an optional thing, and there were parts of comfort, even though it definitely inspired some nihilism in me, like it did you. But there are some parts of it that I thought were really like interesting at the end, where he talks about the path we are on as a planet should terrify anyone living on it, but thinking like one people, all the relevant inputs are within our control. So all of the inputs we're putting into this calculation are actually controllable. A lot of the solutions are there, and that is what's kind of spooky.
Yeah.
In some ways. That's the spectre, the kind of ghost-like knowledge that's floating above us that isn't fictional. It is there, but we're not actually making it real. Is the issue.
Yeah, no, and what I really liked about the book is that at one point he points out that there were climate scientists sort of giving predictions constantly. And then climate change became, a partisan sort of political issue, right? And partisan, bipartisan, are those synonymous?
Who can say?
Look, both sides of the political spectrum disagreed with each other on it, okay? So the right wing decided that climate change didn't exist, and left wing said that, no, guys, please. But what he pointed out there is something that I don't think is spoken about enough, and I see it constantly, which is people who are sort of detractors of climate change or deniers of climate change will find anything, any prediction that was wrong, and say, well, look, they were wrong about this. And that is so frustrating to me, because we're going to make incorrect predictions exactly for the reasons that were said in the book, which is we are in complete control of this. So all of these sort of estimations, these sort of models that are being used, the inputs are incredibly variable. And ultimately, at this point, it seems the input is business as usual. Or maybe we'll chuck up a nuclear plant or two, then take it back down. Thank you, Germany. I'm glad they mentioned that. We can't be definitive about any of this. And I think on top of anger, which I'll get to in a second, on top of anger, we need to have that understanding of science, because there isn't this public understanding of science that is necessary to really sort of get your head around this problem, which is, we don't know anything. Science doesn't prove anything, sort of really explicitly. There's always a little room for error, and we're always ready to throw away incorrect ideas and, bring in the new, more correct ones. And when it comes to climate change, because it's one of those things where, we've got some inputs now, and we've got to see how they're all going to progress over long periods of time. There are so many variables to sort of look into there that we can't be specific. We can't necessarily be absolute in our sort of predictions, but that doesn't make them any less valid or, reliable, really. If we get a range from a climate scientist that goes from, well, that's probably going to be really horrible, but fine, to, oh God, everything and everyone is dead, right? The entire planet explodes, right? We need to understand that we can't just look at the bottom end of that range, because it's probably somewhere in the middle, and there's a non-zero chance that it could be somewhere at the top. And that sort of, I guess, lack of understanding of science is really, really critical to this sort of push against climate change. That's how right-wing sort of parties and people specifically, have managed to convince huge numbers of people that climate change isn't happening, or it's not really that big a deal, or it's not man-made, or, if it is man-made, then we're not going to have that many problems with it, or whatever, it's really, really important that people understand this. And I think this book does a great job of that. And another thing, we were mentioning anger earlier, and it got me thinking, you're mentioning sort of Just Stop Oil and whatnot, and how this book can give you an understanding of other people's anger, which might be useful when you interact with those people. But also, I think that if more people were angry, they would be able to direct their anger at the right place, because people want to be angry. Just Stop Oil does a protest, and people get angry at Just Stop Oil. Craziest thing I can imagine. Honestly, absolutely crazy to me to be mad at these people, when ultimately just be mad at the government. You have people saying oh, look, I agree with, I agree with them on sort of climate change and whatnot, but ultimately I don't agree with their methods. Okay, cool. Well, they wouldn't have to use those methods if the government was it was listening. People have burnt them, and it was mentioned in this book, the sort of self-immolation in, I think it was Brooklyn, in a park in Brooklyn, which I'd forgotten about, and this book kind of brought back, and it made it feel so recent. And I was like, oh yes, people have burnt themselves. Literally the most painful form of suicide that we know of, I think. Self-immolation. Horrid.
I don't want to run that test if there is a more painful way.
No.
Let's not make it a competition.
Exactly. Well, first one to find the most painful. No. But, you can self-immolate and nothing will change. So, yeah, be disruptive. Yes, destroy art or pretend to destroy art. I don't care if the Mona Lisa's gone, because it's going to be fucking gone anyway. Am I allowed to swear? I did anyway.
Oh, yeah.
Good.
We can't talk about the climate without swearing. We're not going to process these emotions.
But you know what I mean? I feel like people... It's this complacency. People feel like they care about the climate. People are like, oh, I do some recycling and whatnot. And so they feel like they care about it, but they don't want to be shown anything. The reason people hate Just Stop Oil is because they're an inconvenience. And on top of being an inconvenience, they're inconvenient and also dead right. So the only thing that you can be mad at them for...
somebody that's inconvenient and right.
No, but that's why
hate
people...
those people.
That's why people hated Extinction Rebellion as well. It's like, okay, well, what can we be mad at them for? Oh, they're stopping working class people from getting to work. Okay, cool. Do you know what's stopping working class people from getting to work? The trains not working because the tracks have buckled because of heat waves, which happened last year. Oh, did anyone care about that? Did anyone get mad at the government for that? No. Let's get mad at individual people, because ultimately all we can do is individualize a problem, right? Okay, so what's going on right now, for example, it's somewhat brought up in this book, and it's not super related to climate change, but it's tangentially related, like sort of the microplastics sort of thing that's going on, wherein plastics are just everywhere now. Yay! We love that. Cool. But recycling, right? Recycling is something that most people, or a lot of people, would do in their homes, right? But apparently, in the UK, if you were to put a Domino's pizza box or any other pizza provider into your recycling, that could ruin your entire street's recycling. Not because we can't clean these things, but because the UK doesn't have the recycling infrastructure in order to deal with that everywhere. Other countries do have it. We don't have it everywhere. It also means that you need to clean out your own stuff at home. And there's this sort of, it's your carbon footprint. What can you do to solve climate change? And not to be, I guess, doomer about this, but there's fuck all that any of us can do to solve climate change at all as individuals. Because even if every single one of us went vegan, even if every single one of us, got rid of our cars and started using public transport, even if all of that happened, that's not going to change the people that are really causing this, which are the people that are the heads of those corporations, that are running the governments, that are making these decisions, to further push the planet into climate catastrophe. And what we can do as individuals, which again mentioned in the book, which I really love this book, because it, in a weird way, it's almost like validating the kind of things I already believe. That's what I mean when I say I didn't come away from it with any sort of revelations. I'm like, it's given me maybe a deeper understanding of these things, but nothing was sort of like, oh, wow. It's just in a really, I like a book that challenges me sometimes. I like a book that challenges me often, but in a way, this book didn't challenge my sort of viewpoint on the situation, because it was already so dire. But what it was sort of saying about, I guess, that individual aspect is that you need to vote. Like, ultimately, voting is more powerful than going vegan or any other sort of personal thing you can do, because a single person's impact is minuscule compared to the impact of, of governments and of companies and whatnot. Most individual people are not the ones deciding to, repeal carbon taxes, like they did in Australia. Most individual people aren't doing that.
Yeah, it was interesting. On the train here, I was listening to an interview with the author, Dave, as I'm going to call him now. I feel like we're intimate. We've gone through some doom, me and Dave. He was talking about how he actually, I think he eats meat. He doesn't do anything personally. He doesn't do anything of the thing. He said he doesn't really recycle.
Yeah, what makes sense.
He doesn't drive. He drives, and all of that I some part of me expected that he would, and not in a way that I think he should, but just that I was like, oh, that's novel that he's being really honest about that. But he said that one of the things that he attributes to a lot of the climate policies changing is public opinion, not public behavior, public opinion. And when those polls go through, politicians get really scared, and they actually do start pushing through some of these policies, not because of any inherent goodness in them, but because they're scared of losing power. Yeah. And actually, I think that's one of the values of reading books like this, or at least some people in some communities reading books like this and then talking anecdotally about the people they know, a few little facts, just seeding that stuff in, because I feel like it's a lack of anger and a lack of opinion about it that I feel like is going to kill us, not the recycling. Yeah. And I think one of the things that actually ignited my anger was trying, and I think that's why I still advocate for doing recycling, trying to eat less meat.
I agree. I think it's good practice. Yeah.
But I think it's a good practice, but I think it's also makes me more angry because it's so hard to do. And I'm sitting there washing out my shitty little tins and my baked bean tins and getting cut on my thing because I'm trying to clean it as best as possible to not ruin the streets recycling. And it makes me angry in a good way, because I'm like, I am doing I'm sitting here like some kind of fool with my scrubby. So I made sure I bought a scrubby so it's not disposable. And I'm like, and this guy, my MP, is sitting on his ass. Do you know what I mean? And I actually feel like once people start trying to live more ethically within the system, they realise that the system does need to change. And I think they come hand in hand. There's a part of the book that just reminded me of what you were saying, and also links back to Halloween.
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow. They talk about why political depression is important.
Oh, yeah.
Zombies don't feel sad, and they certainly don't feel helpless. They just are. Political depression is, at its root, the experience of a creature that is being prevented from being itself.
Yeah, it's good.
And I think that's the thing. What you're referring to is like anger isn't necessarily a bad emotion to have. And I think so. Like in some ways, when you were like, "Oh, this book made me really angry," I was like, "Oh no, I've made Corry read a book that's just made him sad and angry. Like, oh, why did I do that?" But then also, I think it's this fear of feeling negative emotions, and we all talk about like we should all go to therapy and we should do this. And I'm like, part of that mindset is also getting a little bit angry and not being scared of that anger, and
there's anger is useful.
Contextualizing it. And I think for me, I was like trying to think of like how I'd summarize this book, and I'm like, oh, it was kind of it's basically, for me, it was the Mary Poppins of like climate books, because it's like the no nonsense, like, right, that's enough of that. Like, stop focusing on these things, like, don't be an idiot, like, let's focus on the big problems. Let's not fuss about, and like, we just need to clean the room.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter how it happens. If it happens by magic, great. I don't know what this analogy is or where it's
going.
I
like it though.
Of the just like the no nonsense, like get angry and then do something. Yeah. Because ultimately I actually find that quite calming.
No, I get you.
You have to experience the anger, and you get calmer on the other end of it. Whereas before, I think I was just experiencing climate anxiety. I feel like I'm going through the anger and I'm coming out again as weirdly calm.
Well, no, I think that makes sense, because ultimately I think what's going on here is, and again, this is discussed in the book, I really, the more I'm talking about this book, the more I'm realizing that I love it. And, I've got a few different things to say from what you've just said there. So strap in, I'm sorry.
I'm ready.
But initially, I think what's going on there is that, you've got complacency, right? Complacency is what's plaguing, I think, most people when it comes to climate right now, which is they're aware that it's a problem, and that feels bad. We don't want to feel bad emotions, so we avoid it by not thinking about it. Set it aside, right? We get complacent. But ignoring that anxiety and, trying to just get rid of it and feel good despite it is never going to solve the problem. What you're saying about going to therapy there, going to therapy is not avoiding negative emotions. You don't go to your therapist and say, I feel anxious. Can we just talk about happy things today? No, you go to your therapist, you talk about deep, difficult stuff, and you work through it. And the anger, I think, is working through that. Until you stare it in the face, stare the sheer sort of magnitude of this problem, and also the solvability of it. It can be solved, and I'll be somewhat flippant in my language here, pretty easily, right? Like, relatively speaking, like pretty easily. In the book mentions as well, we've got the resources we need to stop water shortage across the world. We've got the resources we need to stop food insecurity. I think it must have been this book, or maybe I was reading this somewhere else, but I'm pretty sure it was this book, mentioned that a few of the billionaires of the world could club together, not even spend all of their money, and solve solve hunger in the US. A few of them could do that.
Wow.
And yeah, that's possible. So we do have the tools to solve the problem. We're just not doing it. And getting angry at that, I think, is the first step to solving it. Because as you're saying, politicians don't care about anything except for getting elected. So that means that they're going to avoid making people feel negative. And climate change makes people feel negative. But if you go to them with that sort of anger, why are you not doing anything? That'll make them start doing it. For example, recycling. We should have recycling plants in the UK. Oh, we've got a shortage of jobs or whatever. Oh, cool. Make recycling plants work better. Oh, should we really be washing and sorting all this stuff at home? No, maybe that could be part of that industry. That could just be a job. There you go. Oh, we don't need people working in supermarkets anymore because we have, like the computers that do it. We just have a couple people working there. That's fine. Have those people go and sort stuff at the recycling plant. There are jobs that can come of this. If we're looking at it from a sort of economic lens, yes, we can make this viable, and it says that in the book as well. There was a sort of number there that I found incredibly interesting. It was the cost of, and I'll paraphrase this, the cost of switching to greener energy and preparing for sort of the effects of climate change is negative. It was like, I think, negative 70 trillion or something, right? As in, we would actually make money by doing it. Yes, we have to spend money to make those changes, but in the long run, we're actually making money. So the cost is negative when you think about it. I find that sort of really not just interesting, but important to think about. We're always being told, oh, the cost of this, the cost of that. the cost is kind of relevant because cost is fake.
Yeah.
It is a made-up idea, and it's not going to mean anything if we don't do something about it now. So cost being a barrier is insane right now, really insane, especially when, I was going to say earlier, when it comes to sort of this focus on individual action. What can an individual do? Not very much, because, let's say meat. Everyone stops eating meat. Yes, these companies would probably, well, not everyone, if more people stopped eating meat, right? These companies would probably have to reduce their meat production, or they'd find other uses for it, or whatever, or they'd start to go under. And what's going to happen then? Are they going to go bust? Are they going to pivot and do something else? No, they'll probably just get subsidies, more subsidies, because meat is more expensive to produce. Categorically speaking, there is no world in which meat can be less expensive than plants. It is physically impossible for that to be the case, because for one thing, to make meat, you need plants. Right, so you already need to grow plants. Okay, not all of those plants are going to be plants that humans can get the full use of, but you need to grow a lot of plants to feed a lot of animals. And then you're going to take those animals and feed them to people. And along the way, those animals have got to grow, they've got to move, they've got heat escaping from them. They're losing a ton of that energy. So there's energy lost at each stage. If we just cut out the middleman, the animals, it's always going to be less expensive and less energy intensive and less labor intensive to just produce plants for people to eat, right? And that's something that we could do. But unfortunately, the companies that produce meat, they're in bed with the government. So whenever something happens, they could be like, oh, well, can we just get more money, please? We want more money.
We didn't do our maths properly. Sorry,
guys.
Didn't do my homework.
You know how capitalism means that if your business doesn't work, it fails? Yeah, we don't like that for us. Can we just have some money?
I don't like how that tastes.
Well, yeah, exactly. So, I think the book really digs into this sort of myth of personal responsibility. And I like that you mentioned, that Dave, old Davey boy, doesn't actually do much himself, because another thing brought up in the book that I really liked. Again, this book is it's quite short. It's a few hundred pages, like 200 pages, but it really manages to touch on a lot of stuff. And the one thing that I found really interesting, not the one thing, one of the many things I found really interesting, was the sort of hypocrisy. He brought up hypocrisy, which is something that's levied against anyone that wants to talk about climate change. You go on to This Morning to talk about it. Where are your clothes from? Are you vegetarian yourself?
Gotcha.
Gotcha. Ooh, the system is broken, but are you not living in the system? Ooh, I'm very smart. Yeah, he brings up the idea of hypocrisy, and ultimately he says, yeah, no, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. This idea of, oh, well, you're not doing everything you can, so we shouldn't listen to you, is an absolute nonsense, because ultimately no one individual doing everything they can is going to change anything, because if you stop eating meat, the meat companies are still going to be, getting subsidized. They're still going to be harming the planet. If you don't buy fast fashion, they're still going to be doing something, do you know what I mean, to impact the planet, because ultimately it's not really the consumer's fault. It's not on the consumer. It's on the companies that are basically doing their best to trick consumers, to get them addicted, to literally get into little pathways in their brain that are set up, from when we were little, like, monkey men wanting to find fruit and stuff. They hijack those and say, yep, you need our products now. That's their goal. And they're always going to do that. And they're always going to seek profit above anything else. So putting it on a consumer to, solve the climate crisis by buying the right things is nonsense. And again, it's specifically brought up in the book, just before he goes on to say, yeah, no, voting it's this sort of neoliberal idea that consumer buying power is one of the most influential things, when realistically, your vote is much more sort of influential than your dollar, is what the book says.
Yeah, and I think it's about this interesting, like, tension between impact and just, like, morality, where I'm like, I know that you're vegan, I'm vegetarian, I'm trying to be as close to vegan as possible.
Well, we're pretty close right now.
Yeah, we're pretty close. Oh, I just got the joke.
Yeah.
I was just like, and then I was like, because
we're physically close.
Oh my god, I'm close to a vegan. It's fine. This is the closest I've ever been. I'm not getting any closer. But like, I think that I'm sticking to a vegetarian diet, not because I think it's going to have the most impact of anything I do in my life. I don't think that's where my high impact could come, but because I'm like, I actually just think it's wrong. On a really boring, like, I don't want to do it because it's wrong, but I'm like, I just think that I think there's a difference between like morality and impact.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because he literally says this on page 6. I am not an environmentalist, And I don't even think of myself as a nature person.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the time we think of people who care as being people who are like nerds, nature nerds, people who are like really into whales or whatever. And it's like, no, like I think there's the selfish impulse in humans is actually a source of optimism for me, because I'm like, it's going to be more profitable. Yeah. You're going to get to live. Yeah. It makes more sense. Everybody likes being right.
Yes.
You could be right and be an environmentalist. Like, there's a lot of things in that I see in the characteristics of people who run the meat industry, or some of the like dark politics, or some of the horrible people that are driving this thing.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I see that energy. And I can, we can use that energy, that need to be right, that need to self-preserve, that need to be the most efficient you can ever be. I'm like, that is actually the kind of initiative we can transform and use for good in the climate movement if we can persuade them.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting, right? Like, capitalism is very much a problem. And it was brought up in the book, and I was worried at the beginning. You know, I was kind of going into it like, I don't know if this is going to be a very liberal sort of view on it. But he very much says, yeah, no, capitalism is a problem here insofar as it is providing the incentive for people to do this, right? Like, ultimately, yes, humans are selfish, but capitalism is a system wherein it incentivizes that selfishness. It really, like, compounds it. So you have people acting against the best interests of everyone on the planet so that they can be rich for... I'm looking at my watch here, and probably about, 20 more years? I don't know. Like they can be rich and then they'll die, but they'll leave the world so much worse off. It's mad. But yeah, no, I think that capitalism being a big part of that problem, as you're saying, is also kind of hopeful, because there is sort of value in the feelings that people have got there if we direct them in the right way. And to sort of bring it back to that Just Stop Oil thing that we were talking about, where people are really, really angry at Just Stop Oil, that is kind of good. Like I was saying, they've got the anger. That's great. Good. Now just read this book so that you understand where you need to direct your anger, because people are angry and they should be angry. I just think that more people need the understanding of how much this is going to impact them, because ultimately I think your general person understands that climate change is kind of a thing, but is probably still stuck to the idea that they had of it back when they sort of first learned about it. Like, I'd imagine most people that learned about sort of climate change in school are still thinking about, what they were taught in school as being true. That rings true for so many things. That's why so many people are saying, it's basic biology when it comes to trans people and whatnot, right? People will default to the knowledge that they kind of first had, and it's really hard to change that from people's brains. So climate change before was a big problem, but also so far in the future, and not really causing, we could solve it if we just kind of hunker down and get things solved, like in good time, whatever.
Roll up our sleeves and dig for England and plant some cabbages. It'll be fine. Yeah,
the deadline's coming, but it's weeks away. We're fine. Don't worry. We'll get it started soon. But it's coming much sooner, and it's happening already. And I think that is something that people don't seem to really get. And I personally didn't understand the true extent of it until reading this book. And I think that's the really valuable thing. Yes, the first few chapters are horrific. They're so hard to get through because it's relentless in just telling you all of this devastation and pointing out, this is on us. This is on us as a species. This is not just the way of things. It's climate change. It's not coming, it's here. It has been here, and it's not about trying to stave it off. It's about trying to stop it as quickly as possible and see if we can maybe reverse it, because we're already in the thick of it. And I don't think people really get that, because, people like hot summers, but they're not going to like hot summers when sea levels rise and when summers become so hot in other parts of the country, other parts of the world, that crops fail. And then there are more migrants, which we know the British people do love, but, it's not going to be all sunshine and daisies. It's mostly going to be sunshine in a bad way. And I don't think people get that. People are angry, but they need to know what to be angry at, I think.
Definitely. And I think as well, what's interesting, about thinking about the sheer scale of human history and then how fast things have amped up, in that I learned that actually Google just turned 25.
Yeah.
I'm older than Google. What's happening? And I think that the kind of power that human organizations can wield in a very short amount of time, again, very sinister, but also really hopeful, because I sometimes just wonder at how smart some people are and how creative humans can be, and how those things are actually, like, there are ways that kind of system can be engineered for good. And I think that I don't know, because just because you can't imagine something being solved doesn't mean that it's not going to be, and at what pace that is going to happen. And I completely recognize all of the reasons for doom.
Yeah.
Because it's completely plausible, and anybody using any reason and any kind of predicting methods can imagine apocalypse very, very fast and very, very soon.
Yeah.
But I think we are also predisposed to not imagine the good side of it if it works, which it may not, because humans are also really good at procrastinating.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, honestly, even if doom is inevitable, enjoy your time.
Yeah.
Don't. I'm not saying sort of, ignore all of this and just have fun. What I'm saying is, if thinking about this is causing a detriment to your experience as a person, that's bad. That's a bad thing. And yes, this is a problem. It's a massive, massive problem. But ultimately, as I was saying earlier, human experience is really all we've got. And we need to, do our best to try and enjoy our time here, even if things are bleak, So don't let it's very much easier said than done, but don't let climate anxiety take over your life. You've still got to try and enjoy yourself, even if the world is coming to an end, Because when the world ends, regardless of whether it's in 20 years, 100 years, or 10 billion years in the future, right? No matter when the human race comes to an end, it's not really gonna make a difference to you, right? Ultimately, on the grand scale, even if you were to die at the same time as the entirety of the human race, that's no different to you than you dying and the human race continuing on, right? So
in terms of like consciousness and
in terms of consciousness, yeah. You're not going to be around after your death, as far as we're aware, to experience the rest of human history. So, if the world is going to end, sure, but remember, nothing matters. You find your own value, and look, nihilism can be really useful. Nothing matters.
I think as well, it's like that thing of like trying to use science and knowledge to be kinder to everybody, in that I want to mentally prepare people for a world in which we won't have cars in 10 years, and like making sure that's not a shock to people's systems, and like being like, oh, I want to keep eating meat, and I'm like, I just don't think it's going to be there. So I need you to get good at cooking now.
Yeah.
Because honestly, you might get meat once a year and you'll enjoy it. And I'm not saying you have to change your sacred Christmas dinner, but I'm just saying that it's not going to be you're not going to be able to get a BLT every day for lunch. So emotionally preparing people for the losses, not only of big things and big cultural things, but also for the small things, just being like, I just don't think it's going to be the same. And that's okay. It's not okay, but
it will be.
Yeah.
It will be.
And I think it's interesting when you talk about like, oh, the world will end, and then you're like, the human race will end, and we so synonymously link those together, where we're like, the world is ending, humans are ending.
Yeah.
Different things.
No, different things, yeah.
But we refer to them as the same.
Yeah. Because for us,
I am the world, because I live in my ego and I live in my head, and if I'm dead, the world's dead.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Wow.
Yeah. No, I know, but it's interesting, right? Like it all kind of ties together in that same way. And I just want to say one last thing on what you're saying about, learn to cook sort of thing. Vegan food isn't bad, you're just bad at cooking. There you go.
Amen. I think that is the takeaway of this whole episode. It's you. It's not them. It's you. And by which that I mean me. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I usually ask people at the end of each episode whether they would recommend this book to anyone and who that might be. Now, we've already had some complicated feelings about that within the episode, but is there any? I think that I would recommend this to somebody who struggles to see the magnitude of things and has a little bit of time to sit down and really get through the first. I'd say you really need to get through the first 30% like in one sitting, because I think that it can be a lot to drag over a long period of time. But I definitely would recommend it to the people who are struggling to like actually feel it. Like they know it, but they don't feel it and they can't contextualize it. Who would you recommend it to?
Yeah, I agree with you, by the way. I did this mostly in sort of a couple really big sittings to reading it all. But I would sort of recommend it, I think, to people who are angry at Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil. People who say, I agree with fighting climate change, and I agree generally with these groups, but I don't agree with their methods. I would recommend it to that kind of person. If you are someone that is aware of climate change, wants to make the effort and sort of doesn't see what these groups do as far too extreme, I don't even think you need to read it. Like, it'd be good to read it. I think people should read it, but like, you are not the person that needs to read it most. I think the people that need to read this book are the people that, don't understand the scale, but think of themselves as being, generally anti-climate change.
So if you have to exist in a space with somebody like that, you could read it for them and then quote stuff at them.
Yeah, no, I'm not even joking.
It's
like,
also
genuinely.
like good ammo for people who are like, well, just paint all the roofs white because that will reflect the sun.
I'll do something, but seriously, no, like, I'm not joking. Like, if you've got someone who is I'm probably going to start doing this. If you've got someone who does have that kind of viewpoint, I think this book genuinely could change minds because it's not preachy. It's very matter of fact, and it starts off with, for someone that's in their, let's say 40s, 50s, perhaps older, it's almost a timeline of all of these events that they're going to remember. Katrina, Irma. I'm just naming women. Oppenheimer. But no, do you know what I mean? It's going to be all these events, and it will contextualize those events in a way that they've probably not experienced before. And I think that is really key to that change, because ultimately, I don't think people who deny climate change are out against groups fighting against climate change. I don't think they're inherently necessarily bad people or, really evil or whatever. I don't think that fully exists. I think they're ignorant or sort of tied to their own biases, which is in some ways not necessarily their fault. But I think this book really puts into perspective in a straightforward way, just a very plain, look, this is how it is. This is the situation. We can do something or not, but ultimately, here's what's going to happen. And I think that could be really useful. So I would recommend it to people who think they care about climate, but you don't think they care about it enough.
Yeah,
really,
definitely. And I think it's also that kind of thing of being like, if you need some useful anger, for the optional apocalypse. That's a
really good. Did you come up with that yourself?
I don't know. Brains. What is the self? Corry, aren't we all connected? Do I even have the ability? They're two words that I didn't make up. I think I put them together.
No, I'm just saying because I feel like that we should be using that. That's like
maybe that's the book.
Like
Maybe I'll write you one.
Do
the
it.
Optional Apocalypse.
Go for it, please. Are you writing a book on? Is that what's going on?
Oh, absolutely not. We don't have time. We don't have time for me to write a book. Me specifically. Where can people find you on the internet?
They can find me at Not Corry everywhere. You can also find my podcast Sci Guys at Sci Guys Pod or at Sci Guys, depending on the platform. And that's about it, really.
That's great. And you can listen to the episode on PCOS that we did together, where you can hear about my ladybeard. What is a ladybeard? Let's unpack that.